That's kind of what I'm going to talk about tonight, the mysticism and madness, because we get into the same kind of situation with reality. What is real? I talked about a little bit about how I've worked with people with some of these serious mental illnesses. This is what some people, mainstream psychiatrists and doctors, would call psychosis. Psychosis being out of touch with reality. See, it makes a difference what is reality. If material reality is all there is, then this is fantasy, this is hallucination, this is something. If you hear voices, or if you have some of these experiences that I'll talk about tonight, that's enough in some people's mind to diagnose you as having a really serious mental illness. And it has happened. Now, it just so happens that I've had some of these experiences, and my guess is that you have too, probably. To tell you a little bit of my story to give you a sense of what I'm talking about, well, let me say this first about this idea that there's more to reality than the physical, that there's these dimensions, these layers. That's a common idea. Wilbur says it's common to all of the wisdom traditions. It's part of the perennial philosophy. In other words, this is just around the world through the ages, this idea right here. It's the basis for almost all of our religions and philosophies that have that metaphysical aspect. And he lays it out in one way. The way I was brought up was, yes, there's more than the physical, but what is it? Well, there's heaven and there's hell, and there's the devil and God. You see, it's still kind of laid out in a spectrum, but it's very black and white and fairly rigid. But then if you have some of these mystical experiences, what are you? Well, you're possessed by the devil or something of that nature. You see, there's different ways of interpreting this great chain of being. And I was raised in Church of God in the Bible Belt, sort of like Edgar Cayce. And Church of God is about as fundamental as you can get. It's about that far from Pentecostal. I mean, we weren't speaking in tongues at my church, but I mean, we were doing all of those sort of mystical, we were doing a lot of those things which were pretty weird at the time when growing up, were a little bit embarrassing to me around some of my friends, but that was what I was brought up with. That was my belief system that I inherited, and that a lot of these mystical experiences, so to speak, these things that fall in these upper levels, were not only possible, but they happened. Everything in the Bible happened just as it's described. And people were able to prophesy and know the future and so forth. So I had that background. I went away to college, and even though it was a Free Methodist college with a kind of a Christian orientation, I pretty well managed to throw the baby out with the bathwater in terms of those beliefs, and became sort of a hippie, pseudo-radical. You know, I had a beard like here and long hair and all that kind of stuff. You just see those old pictures. I drag them out sometimes just to shock people. And this was in the late 60s, early 70s. But one of the things I managed to do was I very consciously just swept away all the beliefs I had that I thought I had inherited from growing up, and I was going to wipe the slate clean and start fresh, one idea or one belief at a time, and say, this is really me, this is not something that I was indoctrinated with or whatever. But I particularly pushed that form of Christianity way far away. Didn't want anything to do with that. That's not real to me. Graduated from school, went out, started the construction business after I got out for a few years, got married, and then some strange things started happening. And it started with buying a book about Edgar Cayce. I mean, when I think back of what really started there, I bought some books by Emanuel Velikovsky, and I picked up a book in a used bookstore about Edgar Cayce because somehow it seemed familiar. And here I am coming from a very materialistic, scientific, intentional kind of philosophy, and I'm attracted to this. But what happens is I start having these premonitions that something terrible is going to happen. And I'll pull out of my driveway and start to head away to work, and go for the first mile or two. I'll have these really negative, morbid thoughts. Something terrible. I was the oldest grandchild, had never been to a funeral, had never seen a dead person. And I would have these thoughts that, this can't continue. I mean, almost a voice, not quite, but almost a voice. Not my normal consciousness to be sure, this can't continue. You're going to have to face some things. You're going to be tested. How are you going to handle it? I'm getting goosebumps thinking about, remember this, I'm standing here shivering, thinking about it. But this would happen for a couple miles, And then I'd go on to work and forget about it. And I'd come back home on that same stretch of road. I'd start having those thoughts again. This went on for several days. And this is totally unlike me. I mean, this is not my regular way of thinking. This is just totally alien to me. And it just so happened on the Saturday, as I was coming along that stretch of road, and I got to about that place where I'd start having those thoughts, I saw cars parked along the road. And it was kind of a dangerous place in the road. There was a dip there. It was a very dangerous place. So to see cars parked there is like, I just couldn't, like, what is this? And I come over the hill and I see back up, I have a new house that I built back in amongst a big forest, and there's cars parked along the driveway going up there. And as I get up there, I get closer, I see the fire truck, and what has happened? My house is burned down. A new house, 3 or 4 months old, burned down, total loss, freakish fire. One of our dogs went back in. We had horses. I actually had a little horse farm there, Arabian horses, and fortunately the horse had kind of a European setup with the stalls and stuff, and fortunately the horse mare went off in the corner and the dog ran back in. They usually say it's the other way around. And I was tested. That was my premonition. And I realized later, well, that's what all those thoughts were about. I was tested, and everything that I had up to that point in my life was gone. Everything I'd collected, books and records and antique furniture and all that, gone just like that. And how was I tested? And I was thinking, actually I was a little bit relieved, because in my thinking I was thinking I was going to lose one of my brothers. For some reason I have 4 brothers, and I was almost convinced that these thoughts were that one of my brothers was going to die just like that, because it was going to be sudden. I knew it was going to be sudden. It was going to be a terrible loss and so forth. And I thought, boy, what happens if they get in an accident or something? So in a way it was kind of a little bit of a relief, but it was still a test. And from that point on, I started having these experiences, out-of-body experiences, precognitive dreams, where you wake up in a cold sweat, you have a dream and it's so real, and you wake up in a cold sweat and you go back to sleep and have this exact same dream again and wake up in a cold sweat and go to work, and the day doesn't happen anything like you expected, but your dream happens during the day just like the dream. That'll start to mess with your mind a little bit in terms of what reality is. How did some part of me know that ahead of time so explicitly? Because I had the dream, I was able to pull it off, in that particular case, make something happen just like that had to happen. And the dream helped me to do that. I knew as soon as it started happening, this is the dream, I need to do this, that sort of thing. I started having synesthesia, to listen to music and experience the music as visions and other kinds of things, and not just imagination, but I mean actually these are the sort of things that people have on psychedelic drugs, and I've never done drugs. I wasn't doing drugs, I wasn't doing psychic development, I wasn't doing meditation, I wasn't doing anything, just sort of, going through life. And then all this started happening to me. And it happened over a period of 2 or 3 years. I started reading everything I could find. Of course, the Edgar Cayce books were handy through the local bookstores, and that was pretty popular back at that point. There was quite a number of them out there. But I read everything, everything, just trying to make sense out of this. And I kept coming back to the Edgar Cayce material. And then after a number of years of doing that, then I started getting conscious about it. Then I started getting up at 2 o'clock in the morning and doing the deep meditation and so forth. And I did that for 2 or 3 or 4 years when I could, and particularly I was in construction in Illinois. You get a lot of opportunity to do that in the winter when it's really bitterly cold. It's a good time to get up and do that, because then it's really fascinating what happens. You get up and meditate, and because you're waking yourself up at that time, you remember the dreams you're having before you wake up, and then you go back to sleep and you remember more dreams in the morning, because there's something about that you don't get quite as far under or something. And then I take a nap in the afternoon and I have real vivid dreams. So it was just like my whole consciousness was altered during this time. And that's when I had one of my first really powerful Kundalini experience after one of those 2 o'clock meditations. It just came up the spine. Started here, and I knew what it was when I'd meditated and gone back to bed, and I was lying there on my right side and about to go to sleep, and all of a sudden here it comes. And it's sort of like the space shuttle taking off. That's the closest I can say for me is what it was. The space shuttle, you know how it's and it's slow, how it kind of starts to come up and then it picks up speed, and that's what it was like. It was coming up my spine. It was crackling like static electricity coming up. And I knew immediately what it was because I'd read quite a bit on Kundalini. I knew this is Kundalini. This is the big time. I've read about this. This is Kundalini. But I also had read Gopi Krishna and some of the people who wrote about Kundalini crisis, and I realized this could have a negative outcome. I mean, this is not automatic. And this is powerful. I'm not in control of this. Is happening to me. This has me. It's in control, whatever it is. And as this comes up, and when it gets up to here, something's going to happen, and I'm not going to be the same, and I'm not in control of it. Kind of frightening. Only thing I could think to do was say, Jesus, be with me. As a prayer of protection or something. Jesus, be with me. That's all I could think of. See, that all that childhood indoctrination kind of paid off in a way, didn't it? When push came to shove, who are you going to call, right? Jesus, be with me. And so the light comes up, or the energy comes up, and there's a flash of light, just like I've seen in some of the books. Brilliant flash of light. And I come up out of my body, and I'd been out of body before, and I knew about that. And I came out of body, I went around the bed, I stood there, and I looked, and there was my body, and there was my wife's body. And I knew I could go wandering off if I wanted to, but I'd also read Robert Monroe, his journeys out of body, and some of the stuff that can happen to you there. And I'm basically kind of a chicken. I'm pretty kind of a conservative type. And it was like, I'm not going to go wandering off. This is enough for now. Dove back into my body. Now, as it turns out, in studying the book of Revelation, which I've done, there's a reason why that happened after 2 or 3 years, why it happened then. It had to do with my daughter. I can't go into that now. The lamb that was slain, so to speak, in the Revelation. Who is worthy to open the seals? The lamb that is slain. The sacrificial aspect of that. It had to do with my daughter. And it happened again several months later. There was another instance. This time it was my brother, and it was a great kind of sacrifice on my part. I really had to set myself aside. But guess what? I did that at 2 o'clock. In between, I fell down a stairwell and crushed my spine, by the way. And that was in my dreams as well. I had this sort of like jam-packed part of my life. But I was recovering from that, and something happened, and I went ahead meditating, and I went back to bed after meditating 2 o'clock in the morning, and it started to come up again. I knew what it was, and it wasn't as powerful this time, but it was still pretty powerful. But this time it was like, okay, I'm ready I'm ready this time. Jesus, be with me anyway, just in case, but I'm ready for this. It comes up, and the flash is not quite as brilliant, and I don't go out of body, but I know that I can, so I will myself out of body this time instead of it happening. It's like some other part of me wanted to show me that it could happen before. And I will myself out of body, and again, that's enough for me, thank you, and back into my body. Kundalini. And I've had similar experiences since then, but what's really important about what I talk about tonight is that raising of that Kundalini changed my life, as well as those other experiences, which I'll for now just call mystical experiences. It changed my life, and it's sort of like losing your virginity in a way. I guess you can't go back. You know what I mean? You open up these centers, and this energy's moving around, and you better find something to do with it. Edgar Cayce said, this is not something you take lightly. You're going to do something with this energy. And so I'll talk about that some tonight, because some people have gotten themselves in trouble working with this energy and not knowing how to work with it. End up very close to mental illness, or sometimes cross the line. And that's one of the themes. One of the themes tonight is, if you're on the spiritual path and you're doing these sorts of things, you need to keep your balance so you don't cross that line into the mental illness side. So that's one of my themes. Another sort of theme is, if you're on that other side, or if you know somebody that's on the other side, what we call the mental illness side, and basically it's just a matter of balance and imbalance of creative energies in many cases. It's just a question. That's what illness is anyways, imbalance for the most part, right? And so it's a matter of balance. And what does that mean if you've actually been diagnosed with an illness? And how might you help a person in that condition? Or how might you help yourself if you find yourself in that condition? Based on Edgar Cayce and some things that I work with. That's basically what I want to talk about tonight. I think that's part of the reason when I went back to school, I had 3 things I was thinking about doing. I was thinking about doing clinical psychology, because I already had a BA in psychology. This is after 15 years of being out of school. I decided to go back to school, graduate school. I was thinking about anthropology, because I was fascinated in ancient mysteries, but I checked with some anthropologists and realized can't make a living doing that for a long time, if ever. And I was looking at physical therapy, and I'd had to give up everything and go to Chicago And this I could do the clinical psychology, keep my business, and it seemed about right at the time. But I also, another reason probably is, they say a lot of psychologists become psychologists because they just want to understand themselves. And so it's, you do it for yourself, kind of self-understanding, self-motivated that way. Perhaps. I wanted to understand some of these experiences. Now, to my joy, when I went back to school, I found out that they weren't doing rats and pigeons in Skinner boxes like they were when I was an undergraduate. That's part of the reason I gave that up. That seemed too silly to me. Most of my professors were Ericksonian hypnotherapists, and that was fascinating. All of a sudden, altered consciousness and these things were okay to look at and talk about. There was a line, you couldn't cross the line, but as long as you stayed on the one side of the line, you were okay. You could do some pretty fascinating things. So in this program, one of the things I remember, one of the experiences I had in terms of this mysticism and madness theme was when I was making the rounds with a psychiatrist when I was doing one of my practicums. We were in a local hospital on the psych ward, and we're sitting at the table, and they bring in a lady and sit her down. Seems like pretty normal to me. It's not like some of these people you think with psychosis and this extreme mental illness can come across as very normal. I mean, what's the big deal? Well, she sits down, and she'd just come to town a few weeks earlier, so she was new to the doctor and myself. And we start talking with her, and she's psychotic, history of schizophrenia, hearing voices, and so forth. And in taking the history, we find out she'd lived in California. By golly, I'm in California now, aren't I? She lived in California, and that her voices had started telling her that she would move to Illinois and live with a relative there, and told her the name of her case manager when she got to Illinois. And she says, you know, Doc, I hadn't had any plans on coming and staying with Aunt so-and-so, but, you know, things happened and I had to move. And so here I am in Illinois, and I get a case manager here, and guess what her name is? Ms. Johnson or whatever it was. She said, Doc, am I crazy or what? And he said, yeah, you're crazy. He started to write out the prescription for Haldol. It's like that. Now I'm sitting there listening to this. Imagine how I felt. I don't say a word because I'm gone if I say anything like, maybe she just had a precognitive experience. Maybe, you know, maybe it's psychic or whatever. If I say anything like that, boom, they won't even bother to put me in a straitjacket. They'll just kick me out the door and I'll be out of the program, okay? And that was pretty clear to me. In fact, in the day program where I was working with people with schizophrenia, they couldn't even talk religion. I mean, if they start to talk religion, they're out the door. That was part of their illness. You see? What's real? That was part of their illness, which was all fascinating to me. Because here I felt like I sort of had a view into the window, into the soul, into the psyche. I have these spirit experiences myself, and I'm able to come across as fairly normal. You know, I can self-monitor, self-awareness, watch what you say, pay attention, and so forth. But at the same time, it's part of my reality. You ever done that before? Kind of be careful about what you say around who? Now, you get around your new age friends or whatever, you know, anything's fair game, right? I mean, the more the better, the bigger your experience is, right? Like bragging almost. So that helps some because you don't have to keep it in. You don't feel sick because you can share it with somebody. And that's real important. This lady that I was telling you about, what was sad about her situation was that she could almost make it. When she came to move to Illinois, she got a job as a secretary. She was high functioning, and she could go to work, and she did it for a few weeks, okay? But the voices started talking to her, and they weren't crazy voices. Sometimes voices like that can be pretty crazy, and sometimes they can be threatening and mean and everything else, and sometimes they can be funny. I've had people with experience in these sort of things tell me some of the stuff that it was funny, the jokes. Their voices would be telling them jokes, and we'd be just sitting there. There's no wonder the guy's sitting there with a smile on his face all the time. I mean, if I was listening to that, you know, it was great. But she could almost make it. And if somebody, it occurred to me, you know, if somebody were just to sit down and reframe that for her, and what I mean by reframe is just give her a way of understanding what she's going through that doesn't necessarily say that you're crazy, because that's what she asked the doctor. She wasn't convinced that she was crazy, But it sure seemed everybody was telling her to hear voices, and particularly if the voices told you stuff that really happened, that's crazy, you see? If that could be reframed, if she could understand herself a little differently, she could have very well might have made it in a normal sort of life. Because when the voices came, she could hear the voices and decide to pay attention or not, and not think she was crazy, and she'd probably be okay. Now, over the years in working with people, I worked in public mental health in Virginia Beach for 5 years in a program that was strictly for people with the diagnosis of psychosis. You had to be psychotic to get in the program. And that was by choice for me. Those are the most fascinating people to be around. Who wants to be around somebody that's anxious and depressed all the time? Be around somebody that's hearing voices and is precognitive and can read your mind. To me, that's a lot more exciting than that other stuff, okay? No doubt about it. But what I found was I could see almost the full spectrum of psychic, paranormal, mystical experiences in those people. Not only precognition, I could have people come up and read my mind, tell me what I was thinking, this one fellow in particular, and he had no idea that he was reading my mind. He thought I was talking. To him, he couldn't tell the difference. He could read my mind, and my mind was not on work. He could read my mind and talk to me and respond to me as if I were talking what I was saying, what I was thinking. And Edgar Cayce actually gave a reading for a woman that said that. Said, you're like a human radio. Said, other people's thoughts are as real to you as sticking a pin or a needle into you. Is that real? And I've experienced that. I've seen that. I've seen people who would have reincarnational bleed-throughs. And they would, particularly a couple of guys, they looked like they just walked right out of the Civil War battle scene. I mean, they had that look. Here they're in Virginia. I mean, we get a lot of that in Virginia, that Civil War stuff. And these guys had beard and everything. And they just looked like you could paste them right into, 18, whatever it was, 60-something, and boom, they just had that look and feel about them. And one guy in particular, he'd come in from the parking lot, and he would say, they're killing people, and he would give explicit descriptions of all the gory stuff they were doing. It was clear what he was describing was a battle scene and people being really severely injured and so forth, and he was living it as real. And so we'd go out with him and do a reality check, and we'd get out there, and sure enough, there was no battle scene going on or whatever. And that was part of our rehabilitation to convince him that what he was experiencing was not real. But it was pretty clear to me that this guy was having reincarnational bleed-throughs. There was something going on here that allowed him to do the sort of things that ARE members pay a lot of money for. Come to conferences and pay a lot of money to be able to do these things. And here he wasn't paying any money for it, and he wasn't particularly wishing it was happening, but it was happening. It was out of control. It was out of balance. That's what made it a mental illness. It was a mental illness, but it certainly had these mystical features. Now, while I was doing this, I had a private practice. And what kind of my specialty was sort of like the fallout from the New Age, people who were going through psychic development or something, some kind of metaphysical development, and they'd start to cross that line. And people would start saying, you're acting crazy or something, or you need to go see Dave McMillan, I kind of developed a reputation from the Heritage Store and the ARE and so forth, that I would start getting clients that were having some of the same sort of experiences as my clients in the public mental health system, not as extreme, to be sure, but the same kind of experiences. Kundalini, I had one lady that would come, she would just turn as red as a beet. She had what's called psychic heat. It's part of the Kundalini awakening. And the reason she got referred to me is because I told my story about the Kundalini awakening in a couple of talks or whatever, and somebody had heard my talk, and she had the same experience, almost to the letter. So when she described to a friend what had happened, you need to go see Dave McMillan. And sure enough, just her coming to me and me sharing my experience and her telling me her experience, that was such a healing to her to have something validated as not being crazy or whatever. It's just in the right context. You had a mystical experience. This was a Kundalini awakening, and you're having these periods where this comes up out of control, and we need to get this energy calmed back down, which we were able to do over about a period of 2 or 3 weeks. Just spontaneously, she had turned red. She actually did it while I was sitting there in one of our sessions. But we were able to calm that energy down and get it under control, and she got her life back. Now, if she would have seen a regular psychotherapist or psychiatrist or something with that, She had been diagnosed, she had been on medication, whoop, over the hill. That's one of the things I really feel good about having that practice. I felt like I saved quite a number of people from going through some very unpleasant experiences if they would have gotten into the mental health system. And I actually had some people in the mental health system that were somewhat people with diagnosed mental illness who were kind of connected in with the ARE and had some friends there, and they had some of that understanding that I was talking about. After I was there for a while, I gave my supervisor my schizophrenia book, the one that has Edgar Cayce in it. I did a master's thesis on schizophrenia when I was in graduate school. My professors loved it, but I left Edgar Cayce out. It was Edgar Cayce's approach to schizophrenia. They loved it. Again, I was watching that line. First thing I did when I got out is I wrote the book the way I wanted to write it. It was my first book on the treatment of schizophrenia. So I gave that book to my supervisor there at Virginia Beach. He gave it back a couple months later, and he said, you know, the things that you've described in your book, that's the direction we're heading. And he was serious. And I knew what he meant. It is a very spiritual place. There's something kind of sacred about this energy that I'm talking about that was manifesting through these people. He recognized it, and he recognized that it had that kind of effect on the staff and the people working there as well. Now, in trying to understand some of this, not only did I look at my own experience, listen to my patients and so forth, but I started looking around to see if anybody else had looked at it the same way, because that's just the way I am. You know, I like to check things out. And sure enough, I found some very interesting viewpoints on this. Joseph Campbell, the famous mythologist, philosopher, noted that the schizophrenic is drowning in the same waters in which the mystic swims with delight. Isn't that interesting? The schizophrenic is drowning in the same waters in which the mystic swims with delight. Gopi Krishna, who I talked about earlier. Now, Gopi Krishna, the significance of Gopi Krishna is that he was sort of a Hindu who undertook this Kundalini yoga on his own, from what I can tell from reading his biography and so forth. He didn't have a guru, he didn't have a master to help him through this process. See, there's safeguards built in Kundalini yoga. There's a master, there's disciplines, there's chop wood and carry water, and so forth. So when you're working with these energies, to keep you in bounds, to keep this from getting out of control, because they recognize that it can be dangerous. If this Kundalini life force energy, if it's raised in this high vibration, it can cause you to be out of balance. And Gopi Krishna had that happen to him. He was meditating for years, doing deep meditation. All of a sudden the Kundalini came up, so like it did for me. But for him, it took several years. He was going in and out of depression and psychosis and anxiety and all sorts of things. It took him quite a while, a number of years, to get his balance back from this. So when I say I was aware of, that there could be a downside to this when I had that first experience and I'd read Gopi Krishna, I was aware of that. Now, Gopi Krishna said there is a close relationship between the psychotic and the mystic. In a mystic, there is a healthy flow of prana into the brain, and in the psychotic, the flow is morbid. In fact, the mystic and the psychotic are two ends of the same process, and the ancient traditions class mad people as mad lovers of God or something divine. Mad lovers of God or something divine. You see that quality there? And I found in looking at the Native American traditions, they had the same idea. Someone that was having these experiences, although they might recognize that there's something not quite right here, but there was an awe. Sometimes I think probably some of the medicine man, the shaman, probably had some of that aura, and probably that was part of their power in the tribe, socially, was that there was some aura about something very weird is going on here, but it's sacred too, in that power. Edgar Cayce gave many readings for people with major mental illness, including schizophrenia, which he called dementia praecox. That was the medical terminology of his time. And he said, such then, these people with schizophrenia, become possessed as of hearing voices because of their closeness to the borderland. Many of these are termed deranged when they may have more of a closeness to the universal than one who may be standing nearby and commenting. Yet they are awry when it comes to being normally balanced or healthy for their activity in a material world. That's a beautiful description of schizophrenia, as far as I'm concerned. The closeness of the borderland, possessed at time, and possession is one of the things I noticed in the people I was working with. Sometimes I experienced people that were possessed. Edgar Cayce, I noticed in a number of those readings in schizophrenia, when I laid them out, there were 5 of them where he recommended the violet ray, which was not the standard treatment for nerve regeneration. It's more the wet cell and that kind of thing. 5 of them, he recommended the violet ray. When I looked at those 5, all 5 involved discarnate possession. Not demonic possession, discarnate possession. He said, we are souls connected in through centers in this body. And he said, it's a home for us as a soul. And if you leave your home open, another soul will want to come in. Isn't that natural? He said, that's natural for a soul to want to come in and have a place to be. And if you leave yourself open, that's what can happen. And so there's a number of readings on that, and I included an appendix on possession in my first book to describe it took some of that weird quality, sort of that demonic sort of thing, and just put it in the context of relationships. And if you're interested in that, ask me about it, and I might elaborate more on that. I'm not going to get into it. But I experienced as one of the things I experienced in the mental health system. I remember one time in particular, I was in the bathroom in the stall with the door closed, doing my business. And one of the guys comes in, and he's really talking to his voices, but he's not talking in the way that he normally does. The personality that's coming through him is not his normal personality. Now, is it multiple personality or something? He's not diagnosed that way, but by sitting there and listening, I got kind of scared because whatever this was coming through him sure had the quality of another entity and not a very friendly entity. So that sort of stuff. So sometimes you have to be careful with this. Edgar Cayce gave a number of readings where he talked about it, that could happen, and I've seen it. So you see, that gets into the pathological. That's definitely mental illness, and Edgar Cayce gave treatments for that. A lot of them were very basic physical treatments, and very often he referred those people to the Still Hildreth Osteopathic Sanitarium in Macon, Missouri for osteopathic treatment, and electrotherapy and hydrotherapy and diet therapy, but also companion therapy, and he said it was a very spiritual place, Still Hildreth, where these osteopaths were. But that was part of his treatment, very natural healing sort of approach. And in fact, in looking at those readings and looking at Edgar Cayce's life and reading a little bit about that, I came to realize that there was a similar kind of process going on with Edgar Cayce. And if you want to read about it, pull out There Is a River and go to page 50. Page 50, There Is a River. That's about the stage of his life as a young person when he's starting to commune with this angelic figure, according to this biography there, and he's starting to sleep with the book under his pillow because he's getting beat up by his dad for being such a poor student, sort of child abuse sort of situation. And about that time, when all that's happening, he's having sort of an awakening here. He goes to school, and I've been to Hopkinsville, and I've seen the little schoolhouse. I was there a couple months ago, and I gave a talk in Hopkinsville. They recently renovated that one-room schoolhouse. So it really gave me a sense of immediacy about this. And he was out in the classroom, and all of a sudden he went from being sort of attention deficit student to being the most brilliant student. He could remember anything. He had photographic memory. He got everything right. And before that, he was sort of the dunce. He was sort of spaced out and just sort of not there. And so the teacher starts asking him questions and so forth. And when he goes out for playground to play in the schoolyard, they start playing baseball, a game that we called, when I was growing up, we called it hot box. They called it Old Sal in his day. And basically you have a couple bases. It's not a full baseball game. You have a couple bases, and you get in this hot box, and they throw the ball back and forth and try to get you out. And he was in the hot box. They were trying to get him out. And apparently they threw the ball, and according to There Is a River, it hit him on the end of the spine. End of the spine. Where's the Kundalini coiled? The base of the spine, right? What happens? He goes back in, and instead of being the kind of shy, retiring little Edgar Cayce, he starts throwing spitballs and laughing out loud and pulling on the girls' pigtails. Teacher starts feeling a little bit guilty, thinking maybe he's upset Edgar by asking all these questions about what's going on. So the teacher sends him home by himself. And on the way home, he rolls in the ditches. He gets out in front of the wagons and flags down the wagons. He goes into the kitchen when he gets home, and his mom is making coffee the old-fashioned way with the skillet. There's green coffee beans there. And he takes the skillet, and these don't have insulators on the handles, by the way, you know, those old type of skillet. So take the skillet, unmindful of the heat, is the way it's put. And he takes it out in the yard, and he starts planting the green coffee beans. At the supper table that night, he basically gets into a food fight with his siblings, throwing food, laughing, carrying on. Normally his father would be a real harsh disciplinarian, but that energy that's there is, like I said earlier, something very weird here, something kind of sacred. There's something that we better pay attention to what's going on. And then, just as they're ready to put him to bed, it changes completely. He goes into a trance. This is his first psychic reading, as far as I can tell. He goes into a trance and gives a reading for himself. He goes into this serious voice. See, there's this change. He goes into this serious voice, and it says he's been hit on the spine. There's an engorgement that's forming at the base of the brain, and if they make up a poultice out of some common herbs and stuff in the kitchen and put that there, it will relieve the pressure, and he'll be okay. And they say, well, what should we do? And well, there's nothing there that can hurt him. Just make it up and give it a try. So they do it, and they put the poultice on, and he lies there, and during the night they have to pull the bed away from the wall because he's banging on the walls, and hooray for Cleveland, he's yelling, and all this kind of stuff all night long. And when he gets up the next morning, gets out of bed, he's totally normal, and he can't remember a thing that's happened from the day before when he got hit with the baseball. Page 50, there is a river. Read about it, okay, if you're interested in this sort of thing. His first psychic reading, and for anybody that knows anything about mental health, that's acute mania. That's mania. Okay, that was a manic episode. The laughing, giggling, and carrying on, and the high spirits, and all that energy, all that sort of stuff. That's mania. That's the kind of stuff I'm used to seeing in my mental health program, for sure. And it happened apparently during this Kundalini awakening and his first psychic reading. Now later, when they ask him, how do you give a psychic reading? As an adult, this asked him, and he describes how this Leiden center opens and this cell moves along this pineal cord, and talks about it in terms of this Kundalini energy that comes up, and there's a flash of light, and if he gets the flash of light, he can give the reading, but if he doesn't get the flash of light, he can't give the reading. That's what I experienced, a flash of light coming up the spine, you see. I could relate to that, Kundalini. And he said that happened every time he gave a psychic reading. And so he had this Kundalini. That's what he was doing, was raising the Kundalini every time he gave a psychic reading, opening the centers. And it tended to put him at in a little bit of jeopardy there in terms of, I think one of the readings talked about, you know, if you're not careful about these energies, you could end up insane. And I know Gertrude is very concerned about that. You can read that in a number of the biographies. She was concerned about that what he was doing could cause him to be insane. Let me make it clear, Edgar Cayce was not mentally ill. Not mentally ill. You heard me say that? It's on tape, right? Edgar Cayce, not mentally ill. In fact, I like to use Edgar Cayce as an example of how you work with creative energies and keep your balance. So before I'm done tonight, I'm going to lay out how Edgar Cayce did that, because it's a good model for any of us that's on the spiritual path. Another thing that I found in the readings, which is very helpful to me in terms of understanding this whole process, was a case of a young lady, 2501, who came to Virginia Beach while he had the hospital. From what I can tell, she was suffering from manic-depressive disorder. Say that is because in a couple of those readings he told the osteopathic physician to watch the phases of the moon, and that when the moon was in a certain phase there would be the periods of the over-hilarious reaction, mania, also called lunacy, traditionally called lunacy, a lunatic. The moon, Luna, okay? So you can, traditionally that connection is there. Lunacy, Luna, the moon, cycling with the moon, mania, maniac, okay? These periods of over-hilarity. And when I looked through the background information, the symptoms were all there again, just like the nervous irritability, and they couldn't trust her to be out in the neighborhood by herself. You know, they had to keep real close because she'd get into trouble, keep a close eye on her. It's just like, again, like the patients I'm used to working with in the mental health system. And what's fascinating about that case is he told the osteopathic physician, he said, along about the 6th reading, he said, you know, if you'll read the book of Revelation and understand that this is talking about
the physical body, the mental body, and the spiritual body, you'll be able to help this young woman. The book of Revelation. They came back and said, well, what do you mean by that? And he says, in the next reading, he said, these energies that are manifesting here, that's the same thing John has described in the book of Revelation. And for those of you who have studied the Revelation, that's where the study of the Revelation began. Those are the 7 spiritual centers, chakras, as they're known in the yoga tradition. And he says it's about this raising of this energy. And so John is describing raising of this Kundalini energy through the centers. And he's describing the process of enlightenment. The Revelation is about enlightenment. And he goes on to talk about later, it's not just the crown of light, but by raising this energy and channeling out to others, you can become as a river of light. I have that posted on my wall. Not just a crown of light, just your personal enlightenment, but an enlightenment for the world. And this is in the Revelation. So that's what the Revelation is about. It's John's vision of what happens in enlightenment. And he says that's what's happening with this young lady. And you need to understand that. There's pressures in the lower part of the spine, he said, in the lumbar area. And that lumbar area, the pressure is affecting this Leiden center. It's the seat of the soul, he called it. It's a center where this energy is somehow stored up. It's a sealed center. And he says somehow that's allowing that energy to escape, and when it comes up, it's out of control. And that's why she's having these symptoms, and basically it's sort of a mental illness rather than enlightenment. Isn't that fascinating? The Revelation. How many of you are students of the Revelation? Anybody work with the Revelation? A couple of you? I've found the Revelation just to be an incredible resource. I give whole weekend talks on the Revelation. I found it to be so rich. Everything is there. Everything you'd want to know about the human condition is in the Revelation. Now, he gave many of those readings in the Revelation have to do with the glands, the endocrine glands in particular, and how those are centers. But also the nervous systems are in there. The book that is written within and on the backside sealed, the 7 seals. See, that's the spinal column and the centers along the spine. And all of it. He said you could take the book of Revelation and Gray's Anatomy, put them side by side, and Gray's Anatomy will interpret the book of Revelation. That's what that osteopathic physician needs to know, that these were talking about literally physical centers in the body that he could manipulate and he could influence. And that's one of the reasons, I'll talk about tomorrow morning, why osteopathy was such a preferred treatment, because the osteopaths, almost all of those osteopathic texts of that era, had a chapter on centers, the concept of centers, where the centers are. And guess what? Their centers were pretty close to the centers that Cayce was talking about when he was talking about the spiritual centers. They were manipulating those centers and doing things to the centers. That's why he was such a good candidate to help this lady. And by the way, from what we can tell from the background information, she did have a recovery, a normal life. She went on to have a family, and apparently everything worked out okay. Isn't that neat? In terms of creative energies, there's a book written called Touched with Fire, and it's written by K. Redfield Jameson. Touched with Fire, Manic-Depressive Illness and the Artistic Temperament. Now, I've talked about mania and used the term manic-depressive. Let me tell you what that means. You understand what depression is? Sort of the common cold and mental illness. We all know what depression is. Mania is sort of the opposite. Think of it that way. So instead of being low, you are high. And you are very high if you really, it gets to be exaltant, and when it really gets that, you almost become like God. And I've seen this, you take on this grandiose, and the power and the creativity and the pressure of speech, and you're talking fast because your mind is racing because you got all these ideas. It's like the whole libraries of the world are in your mind, and if you could somehow just communicate to everybody, it would, you could solve every problem. See, I work with that Kundalini thing and the pressure of speech and all of that. I've had a number of talks where self-regulation, you have to think, okay, yeah, I have all this, but I better slow down because they're not going to get it if I don't, okay? It's a trick you learn when you're working with creative energies. And K. Redfield Jameson, she's a professor of psychiatry at Johns Hopkins University. Professor of psychiatry. And guess what? She has manic-depressive illness. She'd been in the closet for years. She finally came out and wrote this book. So you can be very high-functioning with this condition. And what she did was to go back through history and take the lives of the most creative people in the history of the world our greatest artists, our greatest musicians, our greatest poets, and so forth and so on. She looked at their lives and she says, you know, a lot of these people probably had manic-depressive illness, what we would call manic-depressive illness. And she looked at the cycles. That's the other thing about these creative energies. You know, Edgar Cayce said, follow the cycles of the moon for this one lady that he was talking about. There are these things cycle, and sometimes these energy patterns, sometimes they cycle over years. It might be a 2 or 3 year cycle. For some people, it's called rapid cycling. They'll cycle several times a day in and out of this manic depression, like a roller coaster. It's called an emotional roller coaster. You can see why, ups and downs. And so when she analyzed these great creative geniuses in their lives, she grafted out people like Schumann, see who, some of the other, Mendelssohn I think was in that list, but she would graph out the periods of high productivity when they created all their compositions, and then there would be the low period and they'd be in an insane asylum or they would attempt suicide or something, and then it'd swing back and they'd have all these very creative period, and you can just see their life graphed out in the swing of this Kundalini, if you want to call it that, this life force. Now she doesn't use that terminology, but she's talking about creativity, and what Edgar Cayce was talking about was creative forces. You see the connection. The source of creativity is creative energies, creative forces, the God force within us. And so she's documented that in her own way, and I could relate to that because some of these people I worked with, they were some of the most creative people I've ever met, particularly when they have this kind of problem, manic depressive. It's also called bipolar disorder because you have two poles, mania and depression. Some of the most creative people, particularly when they're in that manic phase, of anyone that I could, you know, great musicians and poets and all kinds of stuff. I enjoyed being around these people. I could kind of relate to that, you see. Now, when I'm working with people with these kind of problems, I make referrals for this kind of, to read this book, because you'll catch a glimpse of yourself in this in a non-pathological way, although she's saying it is kind of pathology if it gets out of balance enough, but yet it's not in the kind of way that we normally think of. What I found was in working with these people is like at a certain point what Edgar Cayce was describing and what I was understanding from the book of Revelation, I was seeing it right before my eyes every day almost. I was in a building with about 70 to 80 people with this illness. Every day we had over 300 people in our program and we would work in the community. So I was seeing, I had ample opportunity to see what I'm talking about here, these cycles and this energy manifesting. And what I came to realize was if I took the psychiatric manual, the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that the psychiatrists use to diagnose mental illness, it's the Bible of psychiatry. It's the highest level of criteria for what makes, you know, how you diagnose mental illness. I'll tell you what, move it on up so we can see the bottom one first. This is called the Manic Features of Kundalini Awakening. Okay, so pull it up, if you can see that. What I found was if I took these symptoms from the psychiatric manual and I laid them out as if I were doing the revelation or if I were doing chakra theory, okay, the symptoms match up very well. And I actually got to the point where I could watch this ebb and flow of creative energy in my patients and I could get a sense of what their issues were and how this energy was manifesting through the various centers. The gonad center, the person may experience increased sexual activity tending toward unrestrained sexual indiscretions. That's that gonad center in the Revelation. The red color, okay, red, sexual energy. And I can relate to these. Most of these things I'm talking about here, when that Kundalini is up, my wife is very happy, you know. Not to elaborate on that, but she knows that the energy is up. I won't go into that. That's in my Revelation talk, when I talk about that, okay? So you don't get that. This is a family camp, right? Okay. The Leidig Center, this would be so overt, and this is one of the things that's well known. You watch some of these people, they're very calm and reserved or whatever, and all of a sudden they become very open and promiscuous and all sorts of things, and you know they're getting sick. But why? What is it? What is it about them getting sick? Well, it's this energy that's coming back up, and it's manifesting through that center. Why is it manifesting through that center? Well, they may have issues about that, because you don't see all of these things in every person, but maybe they have issues with that, the way we have issues with our past lives and other things that are locked into these centers, you see. The Leidig Center, there may be increased creativity Despite lack of any particular talent, the person may start a novel, compose music, or seek publicity for some impractical invention. That's one I have to be careful of. I've written 9 books. I had to self-publish most of them initially, okay? So that whole thing of reality check is, I feel this creativity and so forth, and hopefully it has some value outside of my own frame of reference, you see, but not being able to self-monitor, that's one of the problems people have with this kind of condition, and that gets very grandiose and gets out of control sometimes. The adrenal center, inflated self-esteem or grandiosity is common. Irritability, which may be most apparent when the person is thwarted. The irritable mood may rapidly shift to anger and or explosive outbursts. People with manic depressive illness have the highest homicide rate of any of the mental illnesses. Some of these people, when that energy comes up and if it's manifesting through here, don't cross them. And so you get to recognize those people who have those issues, and boy, when that mania is up, you take somebody with you. If they're out and they're having a psychotic episode, they're doing something, you take somebody with you and you pay attention, because sometimes it can be explosive. Now we're talking pathology here. This is from the psychiatric. A lot of these are directly out of the psychiatric manual. The direct quotes are right from the DSM, and the others are paraphrasing. So we're talking pathology here. But guess what? If you're doing this Kundalini yoga, what Cayce called deep meditation, you're doing some of this stuff, you may notice some of these things. Maybe that much of it. You see? You may notice some of this if that's your issue, and that's why I'm pointing this out to you. If you do, just know what it is and work with it. The thymus, the heart center, some individuals exhibit unrestrained generosity and increased sociability, which includes efforts to renew old acquaintanceships and calling friends at all hours of the night. The person does not recognize the intrusive, domineering, and demanding nature of these interactions. We think of the heart center as being this wonderful center. If you just have love, everything is okay. Well, sometimes even that can get out of balance at times, you see? And sometimes there's a real loss of boundaries there as well, in terms of this inappropriateness of relationships sometimes can really get out of balance and have a real problem with that. The thyroid center, the person may exhibit pressured speech. Manic speech is typically loud, rapid, and difficult to interpret. Notice how slowly I'm talking here. I'm not rapid. I don't have pressured speech. No way. Also, there is increased goal-directed activity with decreased need for sleep. The person awakens several hours before the usual time, full of energy. Why would you want to sleep when you got this Kundalini going? I mean, you got more energy than, you know. The pineal center, the mind seems to be operating at an increased speed, increased intensity, producing a flight of ideas, racing thoughts. Also, the content of the thought process is usually expansive. The bigness you start to see when you get to these higher centers. The pituitary center, increased jollity. And by the way, these centers relate to the astrological scheme. Cayce tied that in through the Revelation. So there's planetary associations with these as well. And I relate to jollity being Jupiter. That's an inside joke. The Planets by Gustav Holst. Any of you know that? It's a composition based on astrology. He's musically described these centers. And so I relate to that with this center, the Jupiter being jollity. And hilarity of mania, you see, that aspect of it. Manifesting as elevated mood is typical. Also, there may be expansive. Transpersonal quality to the experience. And the psychiatric manual says grandiose delusions involving a special relationship to God. God's voice may be heard explaining that the person has a special mission. Have you ever been on a mission from God? So that's one of my favorite lines from the Blues Brothers. We're on a mission from God. So you feel that no matter what I do, it's okay because I'm doing it for God. So it gives you authority to do anything. That'd be a nice situation to be in. I mean, and if anybody crosses you, you're on a mission from God. You've heard it right from God. Have you ever met anybody like that? I've had some of these people come to my practice. I've had 4 Jesuses and a couple Edgar Cayces and a Mary. I've had some people with this type of condition, and they've tapped into some of this reality, and they don't have a frame of reference to understand it except to say, I must be God or I must be Jesus. Otherwise, why would I have all this knowledge and all this power. So I lay this out before you with the idea that if you know, it gives you, knowledge is power. So if you see yourself getting out of control in any of these ways, just beware of what might be going on, and you can calm it down. Massage, body work, like the osteopathy that Edgar Cayce was recommending is an excellent way to do that. And I told you I would give you some of Edgar Cayce's, his recommendations for dealing with these energies. These are good recommendations. These are good recommendations for anybody. These are sort of things we did in our rehabilitation program with people, with the psychiatric patients. Remember, Edgar Cayce had an ideal for working with that energy. What was the ideal? Remember, it's right from almost from the beginning. He wanted to help children. He wanted to help people, and especially little children. He was concerned about giving readings and working with this energy and so forth, but that was his ideal. And I think he was fairly true to that ideal through most of his life. I mean, he had a couple little episodes there when he went out, well, even when he went out on the oil drilling thing. Isn't that a typical kind of mania sort of thing? Leave his family and everything, that your responsibility is expansive enough. I can go out and make all this money and have the hospital be a wonderful thing. It has some of that quality. And he would swing to the other side, the depressive side. But he kept it within a certain balance. That's why I appreciate what he was able to do. Recognize he was raising that energy every day, sometimes twice a day or more, and yet he was able to keep that in such a remarkable control. Part of that was because of the high ideal. He said, if you raise this energy, it needs to be focused out in a constructive way to make the world a better place, to help other people, not just get it caught up within yourself for your own selfishness. Groundedness. This is something we preached in the mental health system. Groundedness. Gardening. Edgar Cayce loved to garden. Carpentry. He liked to fish. He did canning and gave away preserves and jellies and so forth. You see how that's a grounding sort of thing? Keep your feet on the ground. We talk about this in relation to in the mental health system, the groundedness. We actually use that kind of terminology. To use Joseph Campbell's analogy that the schizophrenic is drowning in the same waters in which the mystic swims with delight, well, you either have to learn how to swim or you need to come back to shore, right? And in the mental health system, you're not going to teach them how to be better mystics. You're not going to teach them how to stay psychotic. What you do is you bring them back to shore. You ground them. You try to bring them back into physical reality. And what you typically find is that with a lot of people with these problems, their mystical experiences and so forth are compensations for not being fully incarnate. These people a lot of times are not fully connected in through their centers. They're not fully incarnate in their body. And they're not really comfortable in the world. They're more comfortable out here in the borderland that Cayce was talking about. That's more real to them. They're more comfortable there. But to be fully incarnate and work with the lessons and the struggle of life, that's a real challenge for them. So to be grounded and be fully incarnate is a big challenge. So simple activities like this, if you can get them comfortable doing those sort of things, that can have a remarkable stabilizing influence on these energies. And then the social connections and support group. Family and friends. Remember when they asked Edgar Cayce, how do you go about psychic development? What did he say? The search for God. That's how the Search for God study group got started, as I understand it. Right? In a small group. You have safety there. You have a support system. You have people to mirror back to you. If you start to get out of balance with some of these things, in a loving sort of way, they can mirror back to you and say, give you feedback to keep you within certain bounds. And they can give you loving support. He had that with his family and friends. He had church work. Again, the church work probably goes along with his ideals of service, teaching Sunday school class and going to the prison the jail on Sunday afternoon and giving psychic readings for the prisoners there. Remember that story? Close circle of support. He had other people in the organization from all over the country and probably all over the world that knew him and knew some of his idiosyncrasies and various things, but loved him anyway, and he could feel that support. And particularly at some of those very trying times, like when the hospital closed, these people rallied around him to help him keep his balance. So if you're going to go about this business of psychic development, Kundalini yoga, whatever, if you're going to work with this Kundalini, raising this energy, this is a pretty good format to follow to help keep these creative energies in balance and stay on the healthy side of that line that we're talking about, mysticism and madness. Does that make sense to you? I find this very helpful in my life. Any questions?
David, I just had a question about, just in your experience, the manic-depressive episodes and the cycling between those two types of conditions. I'd never thought about it till tonight, but do you see long periods of cycling, years, between those types that a person can be? Anyway, that's my question.
Yeah, so longer cycling where there's years in between? Yeah, and actually that's a fairly common pattern in the mental health system. It's not unusual if you look through the history. And we would do this with our patients. We would do graphs to see, when did you have your hospitalizations? When were you up? When were you down? We actually did some of that in the mental health system to help the person to start to recognize their own patterns. And that's one of the ways, in terms of if you have the illness, what do you do about it? One of the first things I would encourage people to do, well, the first thing that I would do is kind of give this kind of talk that sort of relieves some of the stigma. You see? Because that kind of healing, it can come like that. All your life you've been told, or at least probably for a lot of your adult life, you've been told you're crazy, that you're mentally ill, you're always going to be mentally ill, and it's the stigma and the self-condemnation that goes along with that is just a tremendous burden. So to have that reframed in the context of, yes, you have an illness, there is an imbalance, but the imbalance is creative energies. The imbalance is the God force. I mean, if you're going to have an imbalance, that's the one to have, right? An imbalance of the God force. And so you put it in that context, and they see themselves differently, and they see themselves in this tradition. That's why I give them the book Touched with Fire. They can see themselves in that tradition of these great creative artists, or see them as part of that. Or they can relate to some of the mystics through the ages, the divine, mad lovers of God that Gopi Krishna was talking about, you see? Now, what you have to be careful with in that point is that you don't endorse the psychosis, you don't encourage them to stay in that imbalance by glorifying it. You have to be careful of that. That's a fine line to walk, okay? But you give them another way of thinking about themselves, and then the next step is to help them become aware. That awareness that I talked about this morning is a form of healing, that realization, that awareness. They need to become aware for themselves of the ebb and flow of these creative energies and how they're manifesting through the centers, so that they can monitor that themselves, and they can say, I can feel the energy coming up. This is what I have to do for myself. They can do it if they're aware that it's possible even to do it. See, they don't have an inkling that any of this is even possible, that it's even part of the problem. But once they're educated to that, then maybe they can start to monitor that, and they can realize, oops, it's getting out of control because of some of my behaviors. Some of these things are starting to happen. I can feel it. I can self-monitor. I know myself, what's happening. And then once you have that awareness, that gives you some power to make choices about how to go about getting that energy back under control. Okay? So there are ways to working with this, and medication can be part of that. Edgar Cayce recommended some of the strongest medications that were available during his day, hypnotics, narcotics. He had some people crushing up lithium tablets and going to lithium springs and drinking the water for some of their problems. And that's what was used in ancient Rome for manic depressive illness. Go to the lithium springs and drink the water if you have this kind of insanity. So there's various ways of dealing with keeping these creative energies in balance, and I leave it as a matter of choice to people. Inform yourself and make an informed choice about how to go about working with creative energies. Yes?
Well, I find in my case I'm bipolar, and my creative energies, because I've been working on it and so much aware of it today, of when it's coming on, etc. It's so simple if you just go into meditation, of becoming grounded. But I'm actually going into grief because my creativity, I'm losing some of that creativity from the manic side, and I'm also decreasing the difficult, because the more I meditate, it tends to level out the chemistry in my body. And so I'm actually coming into a certain amount of recovery or more wellness than I've ever been in a situation. And I'm finding out that the meditation is really a tremendous tool for bipolar.
So learning to work with creative energies. You're doing exactly what I'm talking about, to frame this in terms of creative energies, and how can you self-regulate using medication or using whatever appropriately, but also that it's that empowerment thing again that I talked about this morning as a form of healing, that maybe you can have some input into this. Maybe you can help regulate these energies. Isn't that, that's an empowering sort of idea. When I was working in the mental health system, after a period of time, I was starting to feel this split. And this is, let me address one of the questions I had today at noon. It's feeling of this split of a foot in each world, so to speak. You know, in the metaphysical, spiritual side that I'm talking about, the mystical side, and then being an employee in a psychiatric program. And how do you manage that without feeling split and, you know, affecting you? And that's a tough question. That's something I really had to struggle with. But I found ways to work with some of these ideas in the mental health system. For example, using the psychiatric manual, the new psychiatric manuals begin to recognize that some of these things can be part of your social context or cultural context. So if you come from a culture that believes in spirit possession, or if it believes in reincarnation, or believes in some of these things, if your belief system that you're expressing as a psychiatrist is part of that, your culture, that can't be held against you as a psychiatric symptom. That's kind of neat, isn't it? They're starting to wake up a little bit. It's like, that's again, remember I told you about they wouldn't let you talk about religion in the psychiatric program, you see? And sort of loosening that up a little bit and saying, well, if that's part of your culture, maybe it's not part of your illness. Maybe it's just part of your worldview. Just because it doesn't agree with this materialistic worldview, maybe that's not an illness. So I could use some of that.
How about past life regression? Do you do any of that? And then they just...
I don't do past life regressions with people who are psychotic. Again, I don't try to take them out into deeper waters. If they're drowning in the waters, I try to bring them to shore.
Telling about the psychiatrist about believing in reincarnation and this and that, and without saying, I don't necessarily hear, the voice telling you do this or that. Just, could it be? And for them, how do you address?
Yeah, that's a problem if you're dealing with a psychiatrist or somebody and you're talking about these things. Like the first lady I talked about when she said, am I crazy, doc? And he increased her Haldol. That's part of reality. And if you're in this condition, whether you're mentally ill or not, you just need to have a sense of what reality is. What's going to happen if I do certain things? I mean, we all kind of have that sense of reality, right? So that's one. If I'm doing counseling, private counseling with somebody that's having a Kundalini experience, I'm pretty explicit to lay out, if you do this, or if you do this, or if you do this, you're probably going to end up in a hospital somewhere, and your control is going to be gone, because they're going to do these things to you. You need to know what's going to happen if you let this get out of control too far. I'm real explicit about what it's going to happen if they do this, because that gives them power. Then they have knowledge. They can say, no, I don't want to go there, you see. Now, I can do that, but you have to, otherwise, if you're working with a psychiatrist, you're probably going to have trouble. There's some psychologists that are becoming more open to that. If you find a transpersonal psychologist, a humanistic psychologist, again, we're talking about referrals here, you're much more likely to get that kind of openness. But they're going to be hesitant. They're going to be careful because, again, they don't want to do any harm. And I don't mean to take this lightly. When I work with these people, I feel like I'm on sacred ground. And what I'm doing, I'm very careful, and I'm, not to encourage them to go out into deeper waters with these kind of things. I'm bringing them back in. One of the staff people, she would say, what we're really trying to do here in this program is just to get these people to come and join in the dance of life. They're not in the dance of life. They're off somewhere else. They're not comfortable here with us. They're not comfortable. She wasn't saying these things, but I know her, and I know that she has kind of a metaphysical... See, she found a way to express her metaphysics in terms that other people could feel comfortable with. Wasn't that beautiful? To come and join in the dance of life, to be grounded, to enjoy relationships, to be connected with others, to have joy in life in an appropriate way, pleasure and fun and so forth, within certain balance. Come and join the dance of life. And so that's a pretty good thought to hold as to what is to an ideal almost if you're working with people these problems. But if you're on the spiritual path, Keep a balance. Keep a balance. Use common sense. Use Edgar Cayce's, some of the things that Edgar Cayce said to pay attention to, and you'll do okay. Thank you very much.